Com você. Ué, cadê a... Cadê? Cadê a... Não, cadê a... Cadê a Gisá? Não tá chegando. Não. Minha voz tá saindo, Fernanda.
Good morning to everyone and welcome to our webinar, Gender, Justice and the Pandemic. Before we begin, I would like to inform that all the ideas expressed by FGV professors and guests in this online webinar express the opinion of their authors and not the institution's position. We also repeat that all the present speakers have agreed to participate spontaneously and they authorize the use of their image for this broadcast, which will be available through FGV's official channels. FGV Law Courses Diversity Program, in a partnership with the German Embassy in Brasilia, is pleased to welcome all of you to our international webinar, Gender, Justice and the Pandemic. To build this very relevant debate, we are counting on the presence of 3 women, 3 researchers, professors, and champions of women's human rights, Susanne Baer, Flávia Biroli, and Anielle Franco. I will begin by introducing our panelists for today so that afterwards we may begin our debate. Susanne Baer is a justice of the German Constitutional Court. She has a PhD from Burkhardt University Frankfurt and the award of the City of Frankfurt am Main. She is a professor of public law and gender studies at the Humboldt University in Berlin and a global professor of law at Michigan Law University. Welcome, Justice Baer. Thank you for being with us. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you. Flávia Biroli is a political scientist, author of several books on democracy, gender, and media. She is a political law professor at the Brasilia University and also of feminist law. And she studies public policies in the Brazilian Association of Public Policies. She is part of the research group on democracy and diversity at UNB and also a member of the UN Women group in Brazil. Flávia, thank you very much for being with us. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you. And finally, or last but not least, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Miss Anielle Franco. Anielle Franco holds a master in journalism from North Carolina University in the United States. She has a degree in letters from the Rio State University. She is a speaker and she currently is the director of the Marielle Franco Institute. Anielle, it is a great pleasure to have you. Thank you for being with us. Now I would like to invite our public to participate in the debate that we will start now. You can type your questions on our chat and send them to the panel members. If you are on FGV's channel, please send your questions through the Slido platform. You have the link at the bottom of your screen. And for those who are on YouTube, questions may be asked through the platform's chat box. To begin our debate and open the panel on gender justice and the pandemic, I invite Your Honor, Justice Professor Susanne Baer.
Thank you so much. It is an honor to be on this panel. I apologize that I don't speak Portuguese, so I have to try in English, which is also not my mother tongue, so I think we meet on third ground. It is a pleasure for me and quite a task to talk about gender in the times we are in today, because we are living in troubling times of crisis. And what I would like to briefly comment on is what the particularly Corona crisis looks like from a gender perspective, taking into account the values and the challenges in democracy, the rule of law, and the protection of fundamental rights for all. As a justice of the Constitutional Court of Germany, certainly the legal perspective on law and fundamental rights protection is my prime perspective. Yet, not only as a researcher, but also as a citizen these days, the additional perspective and the whole picture only becomes clear when I take democracy, the society, the challenges around us into account. So I hope not to present a narrowly legal picture of the perspective from Central Europe on the Corona pandemic, but a broader kind of sketch and analysis and maybe an interventional contribution to our debate. So the key question is, and maybe for many, Corona, that's a virus and there's a pandemic. What's the gender point in this? And there is, which became clear in many debates around the world, but maybe not be the dominant perspective on Corona, there is a huge gender dimension to the Corona pandemic, as to all crises. If we look at the climate crisis, if we have looked at the financial crisis, if we look at the crisis of the rule of law, which hits Germany, the American continent, many, many countries in the world, all these crises always also have a gender dimension. This is not to say that they look the same everywhere. This is not to say that there's only gender in them. As we know these days, gender never comes alone. Gender is always intersectionally or multidimensionally correlated to racism, to inequality based on class and education. So it's not only gender, but there's always gender in it and in those crises. So what I would like to focus on, because I have eminent and prominent colleagues on this panel who will add a lot to specific challenges for you in Brazil, what I would like to focus on to start our discussion is, how does Germany react to the pandemic if we take gender into account? Germany being a country of, yes, considerable economic strength, but also a country which still has, we are happy to say, a vibrant democracy, including a plurality of public and private media. Thus, we have still something in our debates which one can call reliable news, which is not something to be taken for granted in societies these days. Second, we have our society, as I would describe it, that values education and research, thus still has something we call facts and truth, which is regarding the pandemic of particular importance. Not only is the Chancellor of Germany right now a natural scientist trained, but also we have a political landscape which is now relying and has to rely on academic research and facts. And one of the challenges out there, that there are people in Germany as throughout the world that challenge these facts, while I'm still happy to say that I live in a country, and I think the European Union is also part of this, that still thinks research is different than, assumptions and conspiracy theories, etc. So facts count. Also, it is, I would say, a political entity under stress from populist attacks, not as much under stress as neighboring countries like Poland and Hungary, or as countries as we've seen in the United States. And I cannot comment on Brazil, but maybe we can focus in our discussion on a comparative impression there. From a German perspective, there is a nationalist populist policy attack out there, which targets democracy, the rule of law, fundamental rights, and again, specifically gender, because it features a sexist agenda. It also features a racist agenda, and this all informs reactions to the corona crisis. Because, and I only want to start with kind of sketching the context we work in, that all these things matter, whether you still have news, whether you believe in research, whether you have a policy which is kind of a working democracy, or whether you live in a policy context where there's already stress, where there are already attacks, where there's already populist forces who want to undo what we need to counter the pandemic. And that's my key point. If we want a state and a society to counter the pandemic, which is actually to prevent people from dying in large numbers, we need a society and institutions that work properly, believe in research and base their things on research, protect fundamental rights, and protect democratic institutions to cater a response to the pandemic, which caters to all. So starting from that kind of brief sketch of the context, I think Germany is one of those countries where things are still in a pretty good shape. As a judge or justice at the Constitutional Court, I should also add the Constitution protects fundamental rights first and foremost, and it's a very active protection. The court is also called upon during the pandemic to still take care that fundamental rights are not neglected, but using the pandemic as an excuse to become more oppressive. So we have a lot of cases on our desks, but then the problem, the response, and the options out there are maybe even more complicated. So I will very briefly take a look at the problem of the corona pandemic, including a gender perspective, the responses to that problem in a welfare state, in a vibrant democracy, in what I have just described, and the options out there. So corona, as said in the beginning, is a gender issue, and UN Women, for example, which runs organizations in all countries, and it's the United Nations organization, called it a crisis of women, even, to highlight the gender dimension of the problem. The virus takes a huge toll. We have 27 million cases and 900,000 deaths right now, counting, and we have more men than women directly affected by the virus and dying from the virus if you take the global empirical data. But we also see, I think in all countries throughout the world, particularly also in Germany, that people are unequally affected. So looking at the pandemic and simply looking at the numbers is not enough. They are shocking. But if we want to understand the pandemic and create a response which is a proper reaction, we have to look at the unequal burden it takes on people or calls upon people, the unequal distribution of the weight of the pandemic regarding different vulnerabilities. And vulnerability, or the likeliness to be harmed by the pandemic, I think is one of the important concepts to look at here. So namely, if I look at Germany, it's age, because older people are more swiftly affected by it, and it's poverty, social standing or class are a huge factor in the pandemic, and these inequalities deepen. But in addition to that, it's also gender. And that becomes clear if we not only look at the health situation in a narrow sense, but look at the social and economic effects of the pandemic. In Germany, the debate right from the beginning was interesting in that regard, because it was a new wave of attention paid to people who were formerly not taken as seriously as one should, which are the nurses. In the very beginning, in the reaction to the pandemic, it was very interesting to see that what was called the system relevant jobs, those who keep the system running, those who have to be the first to be protected, those who are most important in reacting to the pandemic, are the nurses. which is interesting in that it was not the image of the male doctor, but it was the image of the female carer. So the nurses on the front line raised attention and recognition of a traditional female job, underpaid, under-recognized, undervalued, to the forefront. So something gender-related happened there. So we see that in our debate on reacting to the pandemic, women working on the front line and women being the lower paid, the higher risk of infection, the less protected, so a gendered dimension of the problem. We also see that the economic effects in the larger society hit the youngest people first, but then also the women. So it may be that the virus medically does not hit women as much as men, but the virus economically hits women way more than men in our society. When people lose jobs, which means losing income and the ability to support themselves, it happens unequally. The first to go from the market, from the job market, are people in precarious jobs. That is, people in the service providers that are locked down first. And these are service industries where women predominantly worked in the lower paid, untrained, short-term, precarious positions, and those are also the first to be laid off. So the first to pay the price of losing income, losing security, losing a job, losing a perspective have been and are in Europe at least the women. So the lower paid, the faster you lose your job, the more precarious, the less you are protected in reactions to the pandemic. In the United Kingdom, it was 7 times more likely for a young woman to lose a job than for a man. And in Germany, we have similar numbers. That's the economic kind of job security cost. In addition to that, there's another social cost of the dynamic, which is unequally distributed. Home office. Europe talks about home office. That's the new call. That's the new way we work. You look at me, I'm at home. But home for women was never a safe place. And home for women was also never the place to only kind of lay back on the couch and have leisure time, but it was the place where women worked. It's the double burden or triple burden women carry, and it was also the place of domestic violence, of threats to their safety, security, health, and life, them and their children at home. So this new call for the home office is a deeply gendered threat to the roles, equal distribution of burdens, and the security and protection from violence for women. In Germany, one of the most famous sociologists, Jutta Allmendinger, said in May already that we see during the pandemic a re-traditionalizing of roles back to the 1950s. It's a huge debate and research right now. It has also reached the public, which is a good idea, because finally we're discussing who takes the burden at home and what home means for people, and that it is a workplace and not just the place to hang out in front of your TV set. So the domestic work of women, care work, became an issue again, as in regarding the nurses. However, at the same time, what the numbers tell us that yes, men work at home as well, and professional women work at home as well now, but the burden is still unequally distributed. Although both are at home, 27% of women lower their workload, their professional paid workload, to manage the home, while only 15% of the men lower their paid workload to take care of the home. So we still see the inequality in gender relations in employment played out even in the home office. And in addition to that, certainly the violence. When we look at the numbers regarding violence, we see an increase in Britain of 930% emergency calls to a violence help website. What we see in Germany is a 25 to 30% increase of calls to the police. And everybody who works in the area knows that the call to the police is the ultima ratio, a last instance in a long cycle of violence. So we have a huge, huge gray area where we have an estimate, but no clear numbers. But the impression or the data suggests that the problem of increase of domestic violence is outrageous out there and targets women and children first and foremost. So if we look at that, and I can only briefly sketch what the German discussion looks like right now, we see that the corona pandemic, beyond the medical, but including the medical, is deeply gendered, that it increases the inequalities in society, that it's threatening to women economically and physically, personally. So it is a huge gender problem. What has been the response? UN Women, United Nations Women, and UNDP put out a global gender response tracker. It's online. You can research it. It's very interesting. It registers, it monitors how states respond to the corona pandemic and lists the measures and checks whether they took gender into account, whether they paid attention to gender at all. So they also give you fantastic ideas, actually interesting ideas on what states could do properly to react to the pandemic. What we see is, and some of it is certainly depressing because there are some countries who do not react or who use the pandemic to continue a more or less sexist or problematic agenda, but many, many states are also taking steps to really address the problem of women and men equally, thus take gender into account. Courts, again, like my court, are often asked to modify the measures states take. We have to check whether fundamental rights are protected, whether proportionality is the standard met by these measures. And in the beginning, we had to allow the executive to do a lot because we needed a quick response. By now, we have to ask for democracy, that is, the legislator and the citizens to react and not leave everything to government. So there is a democratic question where the courts are called upon to insist that even fighting a crisis is not a war where the government has to do everything alone, but is a time there where democracy, all of us are called upon to act and properly think about it. And this is the job of the courts right now. The prime responsibility, however, lies with all of us and particularly the legislature. And that is in German politics. We have a response, or we look at a response right now where from a gender perspective, I'm not totally happy. Not everything is fine. I don't want to suggest that. But what we see is if you have a working democracy, a pretty strong economy, and the third component, a welfare state, which is a guarantee in our constitution, a welfare state, you find an interesting kind of reaction to the coronavirus. And one is that the reaction to the visibility and recognition of finally women's jobs as nurses and the labor at home was that applause seemed not to be enough. I don't know whether you had these images. We had these images all over where people, particularly in Spain and Italy, went on their balconies and applauded at night to those wonderful women and heroes and heroines who fought the pandemic. That was great. Germans are not as emotional, so we did not go out as much and didn't applaud as much, and we didn't sing also. But what politically happened is that feminists and movements, et cetera, quickly said, you know, great to give people a hand, but give them money too. So there was a fair pay and equal pay debate right away. And this was responded to by the government in that the trillions of fiscal money of euros put to react to the pandemic are now also, at least to a degree, directly catering to families' needs, directly cater to precarious and women's jobs, are targeting low-income families, gave more money to low-income, to single mothers and to single parents. So there is a bit of success in saying, you know, nice to recognize a job, but really give them money, make it equal, close the pay gap, respond to that properly. So there is a huge fiscal package in Germany, in addition to that the European Union just passed yesterday. And in that huge fiscal packet, there are workers' allowances and children's bonuses and single parent tax reductions and extensions of the duration of paid leave, parental leave, and modifications of student loans, et cetera, and to not forget that issue, there is a huge extension of at least services to victims of domestic violence, in that more resources were put into the helplines into the safety houses, into the shelters, etc. I personally have to say there's more that needs to happen there. There's definitely more that needs to happen. But what I would like to highlight is that the feminist and the feminist debate and the demands to say applause is not enough, do something real to help people, succeeded in getting money on the ground by the legislature to services that help to protect women and children from the violence that is coming hand in hand with the pandemic. So this is to say a welfare state in a working democracy that recognizes fundamental rights drafts responses to that pandemic and can take gender into account. Again, not saying that everything's wonderful. But saying that we need, I think, to pay attention to fundamental rights, democratic responsibility, and the welfare state opportunities to use that reaction to the crisis to cater better policies to equally distribute opportunities to all. So what's left? The pandemic, I think, sheds light on, it perpetuates and it increases the inequalities out there. To a degree, the corona crisis is a driver for sex discrimination. It's a driver also in Germany, and we could maybe point at this discussion again, for growing anti-Semitism and racism. It's a driver for really outrageous incidents in society, but it is at the same time a very loud call for fundamental rights and welfare state-based redistribution of resources to all. So we see both. We see the increase in inequalities, the increase in tension, the polarization, the hatred on the social media, etc., but we also see an attempt to use politics in a welfare state and fundamental rights to properly respond to that crisis. And I hope with these few introductory remarks, I opened the door to a broader discussion of this challenge, and I think I'll leave it at that for a quick start for our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, Professor Susanne Baer, for your very important considerations and for the scenario that you have described to open our discussion today in a very rich manner. Now, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Anielle Franco. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. I am Anielle Franco. Today, I am the director of the Marielle Franco Institute, and to bring a humble contribution to our debate, I will make a brief summary of why we are following this struggle in the Marielle Franco Institute, bringing our values and our beliefs. Marielle Franco, as most of you know, was a city council elected in 2016. She was my sister, and she was murdered in 2018 on the 14th of March. She was leaving a work that she had been developing for many months and which was very gratifying. The crime is still unsolved. Over 1,000 days of a life and a dream that was interrupted, and having received over 45,000 votes for the city council. And whenever we are invited to speak about anything that reflects my life and also hers, I begin by asking for empathy, because we never know what other people are going through. So if you do not have empathy for anybody, this is unfortunately what happens in our country, this lack of empathy. And based on our suffering, we created the Marielle Franco Institute. And today I will begin to describe it for you. My mother and I created this institute inspired to empower Black women. Her slogan as a city council was a woman from a community which gains the world, conquers the world, beginning by the university, which is not very typical for Black poor women in Brazil. And we want to remove Black women from this situation. Today we seek equality through Marielle's memory. Our human values are of the utmost importance, and this is why we are in the Institute, not only to defend her memory and what she represented, so many struggles, but also to continue to spread out her legacy and to add it to all those women who call themselves Marielle seeds, to multiply what she has started. This topic today is very strongly connected to my personal history, my family, and Marielle. Her struggle was to implement public policies. We know that women in Brazil have been the most impacted in the pandemic. Usually these women are responsible for their households, and we have an enormous, very high rate of imprisonment in Brazil, the highest population of prisoners, and the highest rate of murders of young Black men, men who are removed from their homes, and therefore the women have to be responsible for the household. And this has been forcing some public policies in our country. And to put the debate in the context of the pandemic, we must also discuss how women have been fighting against COVID-19 in Brazil and in the world. This year, our institute launched 2 projects that I am very proud to head. The first one is Now is the Time. It is a project that was launched together with the NGO called Creole, which has been gathering many Black women around the world. The main focus of this project is to help over 2,500 Black women who are leaders in their communities so that they can receive the allowance that was not being received by many families, and also to help them in their position as leaders to help other people to manage this too. The project has been helping over 10,000 families during the pandemic. And the second project was a very important report in a partnership with a movement called Black Women Decide. It is focused mainly in the state of Rio, and it is made up of young Black women who have been trying to help other Black women in a vulnerable situation. And the name of the project is Where Are We Going? And the report shows that Black women are also showing the direction to the future with their resources of resistance to make up for the absence of the state that is killing us day after day. With the start of the pandemic, we have an even larger number of murders in Brazil. They start with the scrapping of the public system, the public health system, and also impacting basic sanitation, jobs, income. And this has been going on for centuries. And the Black women have been building resources to change this reality. In my opinion, in Brazil, Black and feminist activism has been showing new direction, and the young Black activist women are showing us the meaning of volunteer work and of this kind of struggle, and they are implementing the necessary logistics to multiply their actions among the people who really need their help. As a reaction to the scenario, I would say that Black women are not only suffering from inequality in Brazilian society, but they are also building and developing solutions. They have acquired practice and political experience, and therefore they are managing to get more valued and recognized. And they are using the political space to break down the structural apparatus and showing that effective solutions for society has to start from ourselves. And in this forum, which is discussing democracy, it is important to highlight the role of the state to ensure women's right. A state which is absent and violent, especially towards the Black population. In the 20th century, we have many discussions on structural racism and its consequences, be it caused by the pandemic or by the phrase, "I cannot breathe," as we saw in Black Lives Matter. We must assume, as for example, the Black Coalition for Rights has manifested that there is no democracy with racism. And if racism is at the center of the democratic debate, the Brazilian democratic state will only occur when all these categories are at the center, represented by our bodies in institutions and also outside of institutions. The crime against my sister was a crime against democracy. When a Black woman has her rights restricted anywhere in the world, this is a failure of our modern institutions. Our families will never want to put Marielle on a pedestal anywhere because we know that many people like her are killed, especially in our country, every day. Recently, we saw 2 young girls which were murdered with bullets that were not lost bullets. They were found inside 2 Black bodies. So either we will be able to build this together, holding hands, and not only with Black or white or transgender or LGBT women, but or else we will not be able to build this change. Thank you. Anielle, thank you for your very important comments, which are very powerful. It is always a pleasure to hear you speak and your description of what happened to Marielle. We know that we hear it repeatedly, but it is always very impacting. And this is a story that really needs to be narrated and repeated. Thank you very much, and thank you for the work you are doing. I would now like to give the floor to Professor Flávia Biroli. Flávia. Thank you very much, Lígia. Good morning, good afternoon to all those who are with us from other places. It is a pleasure to be here and to hear Ms. Baer and Ms. Franco. And before I start my contribution, I would like to say that 1,000 days without answers, 1,000 days without Marielle Franco need to be repeated as a central policy need. And as Lígia said, the seriousness of this situation brings a lot of pain and suffering to those who were so strongly impacted by this crime and by all crimes that are practiced against the Black population in Brazil every single day. And therefore, with that, I will start some comments which I hope do contribute to this debate, which has been made so interesting by your comments. I would like to begin with to make a connection between COVID-19, its unequal impacts in the case of Brazil, and how gender relations are connected to the COVID-19 event, and with the way that the Brazilian government has approached the pandemic and its impact on health and the economy. I begin by mentioning a concept that was described by a theoretician from Germany, Isabel Laurie, that has been helping us to think about this situation since the beginning. I am referring to a book. The title is The State of Insecurity, in which she distinguishes three forms of precariousness in our lives. So the first form of precariousness responds or refers to human precariousness, what we share as human beings in our precarious, fragile existence. And it also refers to something that is very important in the gender debate, which has been highlighted by COVID, which is the need for care and assistance that all of us has at a certain point, and the need to care for others, and how this refers to the social aspect. So it's human frailness. The second is the precariousness that changes according to patterns of dominance. In this case, what we have is a dimension of precariousness that shows us how this human frailness that we all share can mean different things according to our social position, especially in societies that are so unequal, and also according to structural standards and patterns. What seems to me important in Isabel Laurie is the third notion of precariousness that she describes, which is precariousness as a form of government, referring to policies that increase insecurity, and at the same time they are based exactly on the high levels of insecurity experienced by the people. So these are policies that function by removing guarantees and rendering existence uncertain, and they mobilize these insecurities as a manner of supporting authoritarian policies. If we think about the relationship between these three dimensions, on the one hand, we touch upon something that has been discussed here, which is the fact that our frailty in terms of health and insecurity facing COVID-19 is experienced according to our possibility of having care when we need it, of having health care when we need it, of being isolated in a house with some kind of protection and comfort, in fact, and this refers to the economic aspect. So what kind of house do we have, or can we be isolated in a comfortable house, and what this house means for the women? But we also see here in the relationship between the first, the second, and the third dimension of precariousness, we have the possibility of relating COVID-19 not only to the social and structural inequalities, but also to the way in which the government, especially in Brazil, has been operating and managing risk, insecurity, and the crisis in general. How are policies for life and for death being presented in this moment when myself and other colleagues in Brazil and in the world see as an erosion of democracy in different parts of the world, and more specifically in Brazil? Very well. When we look at the data in the Brazilian case, what do we see? What is the result of this connection between our frailness, inequalities, and the state policies that were adopted and those that were not adopted? The first point is that, as in other parts of the world, violence against women has grown broadly. In the first semester between March and July with the pandemic, over 700 women were murdered. We also had a raise in the number of murders of women, in the number of calls to help and emergency services, but the records of violence have dropped in the police stations especially. This data come from the Brazilian Public Safety Forum and showing that the attempts to look for protection have grown. But at the same time, women have found it harder and harder to record these aggressions. Also, access to preconception and to legal abortion has been restricted. In the world, Brazil is the country that has the greatest percentage of deaths of pregnant women from COVID-19. This also shows that there has not been proper care, not only for the victims of violence, which has resulted in the greater number of women murdered, but also smaller access to care during pregnancy, as well as to preconception and legal abortion. In Brazil, the black population suffers more than the white population. The deaths among the blacks are higher than among the whites. The standard victim of COVID-19 in Brazil is the poor black man. But as Professor Susanne Baer has mentioned, although this victim, in terms of health and lethal impacts of COVID, is predominantly a man in other parts of the world, the women are the ones who suffered most from the economic impacts. In Brazil, the unemployment rate is 14.4%, very high. Among women, it is 17%. The rates of informality have reached 38%, and they are also greater among women. Now, the main data that I want to report here is that women presently are only 46.3% participating in the job market. This is the lowest rate of the participation of women in the job market in the last 30 years. And why has this happened? I will now very briefly discuss answers and lack of answers on the part of the Brazilian government to give you an idea of how the pandemic finds in human frailness, according to inequality in Brazil, and the perspective in which the state, and I'm very sad to say this, but also very certain to say this, that the Brazilian government has assumed a policy of death that openly operates by selecting and letting live or letting die. And it assumes inequalities as a norm, as a standard. And it also banalizes violence. And this continued during the pandemic. I will now operate with some elements linked to public policies, decisions from our constitutional court, and speeches made by our president, because this will help us to understand COVID-19 in Brazil and its impacts. Well, among many things that President Bolsonaro has said during the pandemic are, so what? Am I a man who works in a cemetery to deal with so many debts? Recently, in also mentioning gender, he says, Brazil should stop being a country of sissies. He also states continuously that liberty is to refuse or reject the collective, and that care is something that is up to each and every person. He also said, for example, that each family should take care of their own elders, that the grandchildren should take care of their grandparents. What has been done, what has not been said, and what has been said very strongly, which reflects how we have been experiencing the pandemic in Brazil. So beginning with what has been done. After a lot of resistance, the emergency allowance payments were approved by the national parliament. This has been, in fact, a very important element to provide support to those who are more vulnerable to the health and economic crisis. And remembering that this allowance initially was $120, and now it is equivalent to $60, and it will stop in December. And the allowance has covered 40% of Brazilian households. And this proves the situation of precariousness of our population and how badly they need such a small allowance. And this has been a trigger to something that we must also say here, which is at a certain point in time, a greater approval of the Bolsonaro administration. But now this approval is again dropping. COVID-19 found Brazil in a context of restrictions of social rights, labor rights, and also under a very strict law that was constitutionalized. This is a rare case in the world, and it establishes a ceiling for expenditures in health, among other areas, which I understand as areas that involve people's fundamental rights. There was a rejection also, or a refusal on the part of the federal government to assume a political leadership. And there were conflicts with the state governors with regards to the measures to be taken during the serious situation of restriction of rights. I also want to bring in another element, which was the fact that our federal Supreme Court was mobilized because the government launched a decree or an executive or a provisional measure to prevent mayors from closing shops and from forcing the population to wear masks. It was measure number 6341, which was approved by the Constitutional Court, giving to states, cities, and the union. And this shows that it was necessary to resort to the Constitutional Court to guarantee governors and mayors' right to establish such protective measures. As for the nurses, as Professor Baer mentioned, there was a moment in which these political disputes were so strong in Brazil that nurses got together and demonstrated before the government's palace, and they were attacked by supporters of President Bolsonaro. I also would like to mention that Parliament, after that, approved indemnity payments to health workers who were working in the pandemic, who had to be taken away or who lost their lives. But President Bolsonaro vetoed totally the bill to pay such indemnity. And this was already in August when the pandemic was quite acute. Another element, Brazil is one of the only countries in the world that kept its schools closed without a national general orientation or guidance with regards to reopening schools. Brazilian schools have spent the whole year of 2020 outside of schools. I will not discuss how complex it is to reopen schools for these families, for these children, but I do mention that this has enormous gender implications because women went back to work with the sexual division of labor in the country. We know that they are the group that is most responsible for caring for the children. But with the schools closed, there was no discussion, no debate whatsoever in Brazil about what it meant for parents and especially for working mothers to keep the schools closed. And the last element I want to mention is that in a country where health has become increasingly a private good, although we do have the SUS, which is the public health system, which is quite good as a basis for COVID. So these austerity measures had to be relaxed. But there is a central element to understand the political irresponsibility. 7 million tests are about to expire, and they are keeping in stock by the health ministry without being used. Almost 5 million were used, so 50% basically of the tests that were available. Almost 30% of the budget that was approved to face COVID-19 in Congress was not used. So what are we talking about here? And I will conclude now with only one final and brief comment, which is in this matching and crossing of the situation, and I see this authoritarian management of life and death, we find economic and health elements, but we also find an ultra conservatism that is the hallmark of the Brazilian government and which places at the core of the discussion on rights protection to families, but refuses the role of the government to provide measures to protect these families effectively. With regards to gender, they refuse to accept that there is a gender issue, and they reaffirm the idea that the problem is individual without even dealing with the sexual division of labor and the social responsibility for care. So the cares that I mentioned are a consequence not only of the pandemic, but of the inequalities that were pre-existent. And then we had the pandemic eroding democracy. We have an authoritarian government and a state that operates in order to standardize inequalities and violence and to suspend this very basic issue of how gender and race inequality operate in our everyday life through the sexual division of labor, through violence and aggression, and the other elements that I briefly described here. Thank you very much, and I hope to have time for the dialogue. Flávia, thank you very much for your very important comments describing our context in numbers and data and giving us a precise idea of the enormous number of problems, challenges, and for describing the very serious situation
Thank you um, it, for your talk in this very important moment. I already said when we met, I had the opportunity to know Marielle, your sister, in an event, in a debate in Rio. Then I met her in many events, and I was very impressed with the conquest of this, so that this woman in March, that women in March 2018 could conquer a lot of rights one day after Danielle's death. So I was there because this evening I asked myself what will happen with these women, because I wanted women to have access to politics, and I was afraid that this woman could have the same, be in the same situation as Marielle. So a lot of women, black women, came into politics because of Marielle, and we are active, also Flávia, Biroli, and now we will try to give safety to women that are in politics and they want to argument. So I believe that the price is high. Sometimes they need to pay with their own life. And
that it is always very costly for the families who have to go forward, and we want to remind you of everyone of the importance of your work. So Anielle is saying goodbye. It was a pleasure to be with you again. Thank you, Flávia, for your contribution. Thank you, Susanne. And I will say goodbye by thanking again for the invitation and also inviting you to add to our efforts at the Institute. We are present in all social media, and we are always open for dialogue. I believe very strongly that we will only change our situation through dialogue. And people who are aggressive towards us only because we are of Marielle's family, I want them to join our debate also. We are caring for the black women who have been elected for political positions in these last elections and who have been suffering attacks. And once again, I say goodbye, and I will gladly accept any other invitations. And now I have a class to give. We do have some questions from our public, and I would like to repeat them to you, and at the same time, I will include some questions of my own so that we can enable a more efficient exchange between our two panelists. I also think it is very interesting in your comments, Flávia. They were very important for Justice Baer to have a better idea of what is going on. I know that you do read news about Brazil and Germany, but Flávia has described very precisely the scenario here. And I believe that the news don't always cover the full seriousness of our situation, especially during this crisis. I will begin with two questions. And then I will follow with some more. The first question was from Carla Diaz. I would like to hear from the panelists their perception about the post-pandemic scenario for women. The second question is unidentified. They want to hear, I would like to hear about the situation of the damages caused by the policies that are clearly against collective safety. The questions were asked to both speakers. Maybe Flávia would begin, or Susanne? Susanne would like to start. Okay.
You are muted. Yeah.
I wanted to point to Flávia, but whatever, I'll start and you jump in. And first of all, I want to say that the discussion, I think, is tremendous in the analytical frame it allows us to use to understand the crisis. Because if I listen properly to Ariel and to you, Flávia, what I hear is that the absence of state and the absence of democratic responsibility is a key problem, and it exposes the deeper logic of governments that restrain from taking up the responsibility to be there for all, to work for the commons, to really adhere to fundamental rights, because that was the great promise. No one left behind, dignity for each and every one, liberty not as saying no to the whole thing, but liberty as entrenched in our social being together and kind of bound together in a society. So I think that is tremendously important. And thus the second question regarding the responsibility of the state and public agents poses not only that political question on the table, amounting to what you, I think, impressively, but also shockingly described as a politics of death and a politics of privileging some to have the option to survive and leaving others to the risk of whatever. And so that is a very clear and also shocking analysis, which we have to engage to understand this. So regarding that lack, the absence of politics, the absence of responsibility poses not only, but also poses a constitutional question, which is very complicated and discussed throughout the world, which is basically in Anglo-American contexts, the question of whether fundamental rights and all these promises of these constitutions and human rights treaties only limit state action. That's the usual. There's a state action requirement, and that you need the image was always, ooh, that dangerous state, the Leviathan from Thomas Hobbes, that bad coalition of forces in those governments, that's the danger. By now we live in different times. The danger is now that we see governments that call themselves democratic or liberal, but I would say are not, and thus abuse the moment of the pandemic and the very institutions that were built to cater to the grand society, to use them for their own privileging, for their own particular needs, etc., etc., etc. So we now are in a situation where our problem is not that states do too much, but very often the problem is that states do nothing. Or to cite Ariel Franco, which I think is a very touching phrase, that states do not show any empathy with anyone who's not in their family, camp, government institution, or whatever. And so that lack of state action, that lack of governmental responsibility, that lack is also constitutionally a lack of recognition of the constitutional promises and the human rights promises out there. So for a court and any constitutional legal system, that's a huge problem because it calls upon the courts, and we have famous cases out there. One of the most interesting ones is Opus versus Turkey from the European Court of Human Rights, which is a domestic violence case, which was brought against a state that did not protect women, that did not do anything, that was in total neglect of the protective needs of women. And the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg said, you know, that's a violation of fundamental rights. And as Ariel Franco said, the crime against Marielle Franco was a crime against democracy. One could say that the European Court of Human Rights then said, to allow for the crime of domestic violence is a violation of fundamental rights. That is, the not doing anything, the absence, the inaction is a violation of a fundamental right. That is, however, still on the global scale, an exception to the rule. However, we are right now in many courts in the world are confronted with the question of the, to use a parallel, inaction to address the other huge crisis of capitalism, which is the climate crisis, violates fundamental rights. And many courts in the world have started to respond to that challenge and saying, you know, if you, government, responsible for all and all our well-being, do not act, then you violate the basic promises in the Constitution. So now regarding the pandemic, in which you described as the policy of death, could one build a case saying it's a violation of the guarantee of health and safety and your life, of dignity, liberty, and equality? It's a violation of these rights if a government simply stands on the sidelines and watches. That's, I think, I mean, that is a very strong case to bring. It is not that this is established doctrine, but there is in the climate crisis and in the domestic violence scene and in an American case and in a Canadian case, there's jurisprudence out there, particularly also in some Southern American countries, and I think in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So I think there is even, not that you need it, if you can solve it politically, fine, but there is also a legal argument which may back up that case of saying this is not democracy, this is not the constitutional rule of law-driven state, if it ignores simply by not doing anything that there are de facto violations of fundamental rights out there. So responding to the second question just posed, yeah, there is a challenge. There's a challenge for the law, for public law, for our understanding of fundamental rights and human rights, that we now have to understand that the danger is not in a state act. The danger is always in a state is also in a state inaction. And to address that properly is a problem. Last thing to say for justice, if I'm not talking as a researcher or somebody profiting from really your brilliant analyses here, that puts a lot of burden on the courts. Because the other dimension one has to think about, okay, so if I bring a case to your Supreme Court, the Constitutional Federal, what is the court to do? Should it, order the government to distribute money? Order the government to change the police force? Order the government to what? Or even worse, order parliament to pass a particular law? That runs counter all our democratic intuitions. However, it may well be that in the 21st century, courts are one of the actors. There's society, there's NGOs, there's a lot of actors. It's not only courts, but one of the actors who have to make that calling on people in power to deliver what they are charged with, which is taking responsibility for the well-being of society and not standing back and simply watching in what you described. I would also want to say that Isabel Loray's work, who is a dear friend of mine, has been written and conceived before the pandemic. It was a reaction to the threats of violence in the war of terror, which poses similar questions. But I think it's brilliant that you apply this concept to what we live in, and it brilliantly worked with Ariel Franco's, at least when I listened to this, because we're looking at a crucial moment in time where something is exposed we may not have seen as clearly before. And it's exposed in a brutal way, in people being killed or in people being letting out there to die. And I think that it's a strong call to action, dialogue to say the least, but maybe also legal action, political action for sure.
Thank you, Ligia. Thank you, Susanne. I really appreciated your reaction to my comments and to Anielle. Ligia had told me before that this would be a great dialogue, and I am enjoying greatly hearing you. I agree with you, and speaking from the perspective of political science and not only based on possibilities of the different courts, I do agree that there is an issue related to how we will reflect upon the relationship between state and fundamental rights. This is something that already existed, as you mentioned yourself. Isabel Lori, at least the translation into English is from 2015. I don't know about the original German version, but she would already mention insecurities in societies where these insecurities have been growing greatly. So her perception about labor rights and about how the reduction of these rights has become a factor for insecurity for people's daily life. And it is, in fact, there are many basic issues. When I talk about this with my students, I mention the example of the McDonald's restaurant workers' strike 3 years ago in the UK. And their central claim was that they were never given their working schedule for the next week. So how can you organize your life to take care of somebody in your family, a child, a sick elder, if you don't know your schedule in work for the next week? And the case in Brazil since 2016, when Constitutional Amendment 95 was approved, it exposes a fundamental elimination of this insecurity, of this predictability based on a restriction of the state's capacity to act. So it goes beyond specific administrations. And this is a very central problem. In the beginning of the pandemic, we had this encounter of an administration which does not have the capacity to act and to ensure fundamental rights with regards to health and security, and an administration on the other side. The first one was the government itself, or the state, encountered with the administration that follows a pattern of contemporary authoritarianism, which is not comparable to older authoritarian systems, and it appears in two different fronts. On one, it is the fact that the central role of the state is to be repressive. And in Brazil, this is now associated to strong militarization. And Rio de Janeiro is the space where this is mostly perceived. Now, this is even more complicated when we think about militarization, and I won't even go into that, because we have a territorial occupation of criminals, the so-called militia and paramilitary organizations, as we see happening also in the African continent. And on the other point, which is the responsibility of the state and a refusal to act in any way. So this makes up politics as a politics of irresponsibility, and therefore it is a politics of death, because it takes on a repressive action. It activates the repressive machine of the state, and it refuses to act within a context of very high insecurity, and in a context in which previous inequalities and lack of justice have grown stronger. I would also like to highlight the gender aspect, but before that, to comment on another thing that Susanne mentioned, which is the relationship between fundamental rights and politics as an alternative to our common sufferings and as a collective construction of these alternatives. This is what is being denied and refused and highlighted even more by the pandemic. So going back to gender, in order to answer Carla Diaz's question, we have an element that I touched upon very lightly here in Brazil, which is the situation that brings at the same time lack of protection and the idea that the only space where you can find some protection is within the family. So you have the idea of the family, a conventional excludent family that is presented in a fictional fantasy manner as the protection individuals should have. And it is interesting that during the pandemic, an administration that positions itself as not having any responsibility, refusing any responsibility, has for several times mentioned and known that what people have to protect themselves is their own individual capacity to work. It doesn't matter whether they have rights, whether they are sick or not, and the family that can protect you in case this is not possible individually, or in case you cannot protect yourself individually. And Susanne, we have a ministry today that has replaced the institution of women's rights. It is the Ministry of Women, Family, and Human Rights. During the pandemic, this ministry was very active. However, they brought policies to strengthen the Brazilian family in a perspective which is a mixture of fiction, because you have no concrete action to maintain protection to people. So it is a mixture of fiction and a project. And this project is to bring down the responsibility of the state and to increase the responsibility of the family, saying that the family must be functional and that it must establish the moral order and the economic order. The moral order is the patriarchy and any possible adjustments so that protection of people can be started from within the family. And that also includes the economic protection because the state refuses such protection. So I will stop here. I believe I was excited by Susanne's comments and I went on, but I do imagine we have other questions to answer. So thank you very much. Thank you, Flávia. Your dialogue has been raising even more questions. So I will use my power as a moderator and select some questions and also ask some questions of my own that also include questions that are made from our public. So thinking about what you said, Flávia, about the treatment or the classification of the Brazilian state as a state of inaction and of privatizing the tasks and responsibilities that were traditionally of the state and treating care as a policy and removing any responsibility from the state, it occurs to me that we must also reflect upon whether what some people call unliberal policies, whether they would also be connected to a certain model of liberalism, that is, the total absence of the state and placing responsibility of managing an increasingly precarious life on the hands of individuals and private segments. And the only solidarity that is possible is family solidarity, and that all possibilities are anchored on women's labor. So I think this is very relevant because in Brazil, we have been witnessing a great increase of this bringing down of the state apparatus, which, by the way, is included as a fundamental right in our Constitution to provide a minimum level of well-being. This is in our Constitution. And so to refer to the classification that you mentioned from Laurie's work, the Brazilian Constitutional Court was responsible for allowing this state of precariousness along the last year. So on the one hand, the court has been protecting individual rights for LGBTs, for example, but on the other hand, it is eliminating the social guarantees. So I am referring to the outsourcing of activities. I refer to the discussion that is going on in the Supreme Court about intermittent labor, where you could consider the Uberization, or rather people who have to be permanently on call and ready to be called for any kind of job or service for very low pay and without any form of guarantee, and which impacts women more strongly. So I was thinking about Flavia's comments, and then I have this question about the case for the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. I believe we do have a case, Susanne, but our difficulty now is that the court does not have the necessary enforcement mechanisms. And we are facing a government, an administration that gives it back to all the international institutions that ensure human rights, such as the United Nations and the Inter-American Human Rights Court, and very explicitly so, they say that human rights are for criminals or come from criminals, and therefore they oppose themselves explicitly to any human rights mechanisms. And finally, I ask myself whether in the state's feminist policy, whether we build the state as a masculine, or if we are experiencing a hyper masculinization of the state in Brazil at the cost of women. So these are some considerations and comments that I would like to bring to your debate. And here I will include a question from Mariana Borges. I will ask Flávia to answer this question, and then I have another one for Susanne. Is it possible to say that the coronavirus crisis is a crisis of capitalism, considering the rush for vaccines in many countries and the inequalities that have been highlighted as the speakers mentioned? How do the speakers see the role and importance of feminism for those that is anti-capitalistic, anti-internationalism to build a new normal? That is, Mariana was also referring to Ms. Baer. So I read this question, Flávia will answer, and then we will have the next ones.
Quer que eu comece?
Okay, I will begin. Thank you, Ligia, for your comments. Thank you, Mariana, who asked the question. Ligia, I will answer Mariana's question, and that will help me to touch upon some of the points you mentioned in your own comments. So, Mariana, there are many manners, but there are two main manners to make a connection between the COVID crisis and the capitalism crisis. On the one hand, you have the relationship between the pandemic, the environment, and forms of occupation of the soil and use of natural resources around the globe and also locally. So this pandemic, it shows very openly the mistakes in use and occupation of the soil and of natural resources. And it also brings up an emergency, which we already knew was an emergency, but now we have the collective responsibility over the environment and climate change. Obviously, I am not very knowledgeable of medicine and biology, but I read obsessively about this and about pandemics during the first few months of the pandemic. And from what I understand from my readings, it is very clear that we do have very deep issues for which we have to be politically responsible globally so that mankind does not pass from one pandemic to the next, because it seems like the time between pandemics can become shorter with the very predatory occupation and degradation of our planet, which is being sped up. But in countries like Brazil, the pandemic meets other pandemics. We had dengue fever, we had Zika fever. It is still impacting Brazilian women, especially in the poorer regions of the world. And COVID-19 came to add to these two pandemics. This is a warning about how capitalism functions. We have the local difficulties, and you have globally also these predatory forms of occupation which directly impact people. Now, with regards to feminism for 99%, that will lead me to a point, and then I will give the floor to Susanne. This is not a response or a solution. It is simply a problem that concerns me greatly, which is the following. We know that there is an issue that presents itself to the globe with regards to how financial capitalism organizes itself and captures the capacity of nation states because it imposes goals and budget concerns. This happens around the planet, and the reactions in the case of feminism have shown us that they are transnational in character, and they are very important for us to be able to resist and to criticize this global manner of standardizing violence and inequalities, just to put it briefly. So what my concern is that people's suffering occurs at the local level, and this has been shown clearly by the pandemic. It is in the local level and in our everyday life. And we have a kind of capitalism. Well, capitalism always impacted the whole globe, but in the last decades, nation states have become hostage to rationales that are not local. So while feminisms can act transborder globally and resisting this global manner of emphasizing and broadening inequalities and also impacting the national policies, and at the same time dealing with all the the pain of the resentments that are caused locally from that global manner. We see that this happens in countries like Brazil's. There is a growing resentment on how people are suffering every day, and the state is simply a space for repression and corruption, but not for action. I'm sorry I went on too long, but I would like to connect this to our last elections. Recently, we had elections for the local governments, the city governments, and I was very happy to see something that I had been waiting for many years. And this has to do with something with Marielle's legacy, which is that we had more young Black women as candidates and who act upon the local agenda, such as violence against Blacks and against women, but which also have a very clear idea of social justice with regards to the role of the state and their critique of capitalism as a predatory system that destroys our possibility of having a better life, the environment, but also the state and its reach, both locally and nationally. So I have mixed up a series of things, but it seems that we do face a challenge, in fact. We have the global issue, how capitalism works, and this is related to the environment and how the pandemics function. We have relationships that are being developed globally that are very strong and based on feminism. And then we have the local level where we have to find political alternatives, but where the state has a very low capacity, and these resentments that feed into authoritarian policies. So this is my answer to Mariana. I'm sorry I went on for so long. Thank you, Flávia. Susanne.
Your microphone is off.
my microphone is now on. I'm humble in trying to add something to what you just said, because there's so many issues now on the table, and I think that's already a very rich response to these questions. I take the opportunity to make a remark on something which comes up in our discussion here, which is the role of the state in all its ambivalence. And I just want to remind us that for the longest time, critical analyses of the law and the state, including feminist ones, including anti-racist and post-colonial work, have highlighted not only that the state may be repressive and a problem and authoritarian and militarized, etc., but that it is indeed highly ambivalent, always, because it is a site and a source of power that can be used either way. And the pandemic very much shows this to us, that nothing there can be taken for granted. Somebody says democracy and in fact means something entirely else. What Lydia said, somebody called something still liberal, which I do not think deserves the name even. So we are again and again and again in an intense discussion and see the necessity to put that all on the table again and to clarify what we mean when we say, you know, this is a democratic state and this is part of the global family of states. So the ambivalence of all these institutions, I think, is very, very important regarding the law. There has been Carol Smart, a British sociologist, who always warned movements to resist the siren call of the law, because your ship will then end up in the cliffs and sink if you listen to the siren call of the law. And I think for me as a lawyer and a judge now, that's an important one. And I think there's a siren call of the state as well, which says, you know, you need it. You cannot leave it in somebody else's hand. You cannot ignore it. But at the same time, you have to be really careful how close you get, what you ask of it, and how you design it properly. So I think what we're discussing right now is proper design for a future that that balances action and inaction to leave enough room for people in all their diversity to move and to survive and to live in. And I think we're revisiting a classic here. But what the questions from the audience also tell me, that the moment of this pandemic exposes the price to pay when we misunderstand something or are naive about the ambivalence of state and law. The price is really high and will be paid by the weakest segments in society, which are the poor, the racialized minorities, and women. And so I think this exposure at this moment in time is a call on all of us to react. There was a second point regarding the courts. What do you expect of the courts? And I'm very interested in following your analysis of also your own Supreme Court, the Tribunal Federal, and other courts' role in this. As a sitting justice, I would say that the role of courts is a tricky one. We are the safety belt, but not the main player. We only respond to questions and never drive them. We can only do so much in what Lydia said about the Inter-American Court, in that we only have the power of the word, not the power of the budget, and not the power of the sword or some weapon. So it's a very tricky institution to certainly safeguard the very basics of all of our polities, yet at the same time be very limited in its scope of activity and its opportunity to respond, also being coded as law, which always means you have the answer yes or no, and not the creativity of the political process, makes them quite tricky actors, let's put it that way, which also means that courts will never, ever replace the political work out there. They will allow for it, they may protect it. They may protect what Marielle called dialogue and the necessity of dialogue beyond stereotype, beyond bias, beyond everything. But they will not replace that type of conversation we are engaging in right now, and we need to have in the future. So I think that is important to me to to arrange all these actors and spaces we're talking about at the moment. But I think, Lydia, you had another question.
Yes, I have several. Eu gostaria de colocar.
I will now try to put together some questions that were sent by our public. Somebody who has not identified themselves asked, the topic gender refers to what we inherit with regards to gender and class. In Brazil, this also includes the geographic regional factor. And in Brazil, corruption has been contributed to making public policies for democracy and gender even more precarious. In a context like Germany, what actions would be necessary to advance in the gender issue, which the pandemic has highlighted? I will put that question together with two other questions. The first one is specifically directed to Susanne Baer. The topic gender refers us to, I'm sorry, I was reading the same question. Professor Clara Araújo, who is watching us. Professor Clara, thank you very much for participating in our debate. It is an honor to have you with us. Professor Clara Araújo's question, and she is congratulating our event. What would be the central and common points in a global agenda for acknowledging and redistributing household or domestic responsibilities? I would say Susanne can start. Yes, Ms. Baer.
I would very much like to leave the final words on that summary to Flávia Biroli, because I think she's way more capable of drawing or giving us a perspective on that agenda. But let me try to start. And thank you for the questions, great questions. And the complicated questions. Germany and Brazil have some things in common, but there's a lot very different. And so for me to respond to the question of, what is the action you expect, or what is the necessity to be done in Germany, when I compare it to the situation in Brazil, is very difficult to answer. And there is a huge political agenda out there to properly address gender inequalities in Germany, as good as it is, and still there's a lot to do. We have one of the biggest gender pay gaps in Europe, at least. We have still a gender pension gap, which results from the pay gap. We have a lot of economic inequalities. We have a lot of sexual violence. We have topics which are not even considered violence, some dimensions of pornography and prostitution, which are considered, just another job, which is highly problematic, etc., etc., etc. So there's a huge agenda out there. If I look at at what we have been addressing today, I think that the combination of economic protection and economic stability and foreseeability, something Flávia mentioned as well, something called security in the old age, which was never a term particularly close to feminism or any other radical policies, but maybe we should reconfigure that and think about security, stability, foreseeability as crucial elements in our lives that allow us to, not go crazy with that pandemic, not knowing what happens next, and whenever we will be, whenever I will be allowed again to hug my mother. So if we don't want to go crazy, then maybe those classic conservative terms have to be reconfigured in a progressive policy that seriously addresses on equal terms the recognition of each and every one to live as free as possible. That's, to me, the combination of dignity, equality, and liberty, which is the start of the human rights catalog throughout the world. And so I think to reclaim those kind of classics, basic elements of political and social foreseeability and stability is a good one. And thus, the German and European effort to implement within the economic package gender equality, to put gender equality into the larger economic frame and not pursue it as an extra, I think is one of the most important elements of that strategy. Sustainability and the fight against the climate crisis would be the other element to mainstream into these packages, but to not think things apart, but think them together, an integrated approach. And the second one I would like to mention is, because there was a question on, you know, the new normal and what to do next, and how do we get there, and what to do. There is, I'm happy to be part of a research group in Germany around law, gender, and collectivity. And we're moving into our second phase. And what we're looking at now is the fights around the commons and the new commonalities, or the new shared we're looking at. And this is referring to work by Sabine Haag, Rael Jägi, Ina Kerner, and Hannah Meissner, German philosophers and feminist scholars and theorists, das umkämpfte Allgemeine und das neue Gemeinsame, which is a very interesting, I think, approach to think democracy, society, etc., beyond identity. That's a key point there, beyond identity. And take note, identity was an important source for LGBTI movements, for the women's movement, for the post-colonial movement, and it's now beyond identity, claiming some of the formerly conservative topics and issues and reframe our idea of the commons or the grander together. It's very difficult to translate. That's the idea. And I can only get back to Anielle Franco. It's about dialogue. And dialogue is not easy, and dialogue is not conflict free, and dialogue is not the nice social bubble talk with your friends in your little timeline. Dialogue means confront these questions with the willingness to get through it in a civilized manner. That's a tough call on us. But final comment, and this I personally think, as a critical legal scholar, will not be a new normal, because the normal is a problem. I don't want no new normal. What I want is a new plurality of the ability to live together. That's, to me, I know what the new normal means, but I only want to raise attention to the normality assumption, which sleeps in the new normal, which may be a problem. And thus we're looking at really a reconfiguration of many things we cherished, and also a reassessment of things we used ourselves to be better, to move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne.
Well, I will begin, and I will try to be brief, by saying that I was very positively impressed with Suzanne's description of the project and the core of the project, which is to reconfigure the common in this perspective. It seems to be a very central element today if we think about what has gone on with democracies around the globe. I have recently done research on movements that are against gender equality and sexual freedom in Latin American countries. I've done it together with Maria das Dores Machado and colleagues. It was recently published. And one thing that attracted my attention when I was monitoring demonstrations against the gender agenda in Peru, Mexico, Paraguay, and other Latin American countries was the idea that they were demonstrating on behalf of democracy, because they were seeing democracy at risk. And this was claimed by minorities guided by ideas that were foreign to the ideas that were defended by the majority. This comes back from the 1960s in the United States, the moral majority and the Christian majority. And this got me thinking very much about how the very meaning of democracy is being disputed, so that we can define more clearly, first of all, what forms of authoritarianism we are seeing, and in the name of whom are they being justified, even though they define themselves as the quote-unquote majority democracy in a very deep sense, that there are majorities that should be considered by these democracies. And the other point is how this anti-pluralism conquers space based on people's fears and feeling of insecurity. In my work, I call this a moralization of insecurity. So how insecurities in Latin America, which include violence, for example, violence that against the black sons of black women who fear that their black sons will be subjected to, and how all this is being presented as something that is connected to a moral order. So on the one hand, you have this authoritarianism that brings this majority, and on the other hand, you have the pluralism that moralizes insecurities and justifies criminalizing your enemy, because after all, a threat to myself and to my family is localized in the other, and this other can present a threat because it would be devious morally, such as the LGBT population or foreign ideas. All those would be used as justifications to stress the idea of protection, which has nothing to do with the idea of protection that we have in democracy as we have studied and defended it. So it seems that it is very important that we understand that there is this dispute regarding the political language, and as well as the role of the state, and a dispute with regards to pluralism. And I would like to close by saying that today I see as a great challenge exactly how to show more clearly how these erosions of democratic values and democracies and gender is a very central point here, but it is not a separate agenda. So as Susanne said, how can we bring this aspect of social plurality, gender, and race as something that is at the core of social justice, that defines us as a society and as our common alternatives? And it seems that we are right at this moment. Susanne before was talking about the re-traditionalization of different roles. This is at the very center of the erosion of democracy that we see in Brazil, in Hungary, and in Poland. So finally, to Clara, I would say that in these processes of weakening democracy, there has been an appeal or a call to redefine roles because of a social aspect and also because of the economic aspect, because in the restriction of social guarantees, women are being pushed to assume responsibility. during the pandemic, the closing of schools in Brazil is a very strong example of what is going on. So I think that our task, both globally and locally, as Susanne said, is that we have to be clear that there is this political dispute with regards to the meaning of democracy, plurality, and commonality, and that we should refuse to accept the quote-unquote majority. We cannot accept the idea that democracy reflects perceptions of the so-called moral majorities, because this is a big threat and we see this happening in different regions of the world. And then bring in a very active manner our analyses as a collective construction of alternatives. In the academy, maybe in the field of law, we need to join other such initiatives to have a more critical view of what is going on so that we can together think about alternatives for these very difficult moments. Ligia, thank you again. I thank you, Flávia. We have arrived at the end of our event, but before closing, I would like to offer to you a chance of making your final considerations if you so wish. I will list my thanks. I thank enormously Flávia Biroli, Professor Flávia Biroli, my dear friend, for your considerations, always very rich, and which bring great light on our legal and political situation, so that together we can reflect upon how we will build a society in the near future that is better. I also want to thank my teacher, my guidance counselor, Susanne Baer, for her presence, for her time, for being available, for bringing her ideas, always so brilliant and clarifying, and which also bring and raise new questions for us to reflect upon, which is very important. So thank you both. I also want to thank Anielle Franco, who was with us in the beginning of the panel, for her trajectory, for her family's struggle, also for a fairer society for all of us. I also thank the team at the diversity program of Fundação Getulio Vargas. Without them, we would never have these events. Natalia Pazetti, Gabriela Caruso, who are helping us with the questions in this event. I also thank the German embassy in Brasilia and the German consulate in Rio de Janeiro for their partnership and dedication to organize this event today. Thank you, Michael Westland. Thank you, Eva Plum. Leia Plum, I'm sorry. I also want to thank the communications team at FGV, Ana Cristina Couto, Nicole Furtado, Cristal, the CoLab team, our interpreters, and the public who has been with us, sending questions. Thank you all. So do our speakers have any final comments? And then we will close our panel.
Very, very rich exchange. And I also thank the German embassy to supporting that, but I also thank you, Ligia, to creating this space. And I really wish there will be more such conversations, because we're looking at complicated questions and we need better answers. Thank you.
Eu também.
I too, Ligia, would like to thank you once more. To me, it was a very rich dialogue and a great pleasure. I learned very much. Thank you. Thanks to FGV. Thanks to the German Embassy. It was a pleasure to be able to dialogue with Susanne and Anielle. And I also hope that we have new opportunities in the near future to go on reflecting about all these challenges we are facing. Thank you again, Professor Biroli, Professor Baer, and we'll see you next time.